All right, well, let's open a word of prayer, shall we? Again, Father in heaven, we thank you for this time together. We're thankful you've blessed in each one of our lives. It's a good day to be alive, always is. And in the meantime, we pray, our Father which art in heaven, thy kingdom come, maybe even tonight. And while we're still here on earth, help us to be faithful. We know that we are needy people. So we pray for those in need, specifically mentioned daughter's broken arm. We just pray that you'll heal and be able to recover her body soon to get back into the normalcy of what you have in store for her. We just thank you for each one here, and we know you reward those that faithfully seek you and study your word. And so just give us an extra measure of your blessings through your Spirit. We ask these things in Christ's name. Amen. Well, we've been looking at the context of the ancient world. So we've been romping through the Old Testament. We romped last year through Genesis, and this year we're romping through the book of Exodus, okay? And so Exodus, of course, sets the stage. You all know very well that Abraham migrated down into Egypt, all right? Egypt plays a vital role in the history of Israel, does it not? All the way down to the very end, almost. Even Herod the Great had, actually Cleopatra tried to have an affair with Herod, but he resisted, as she had done so many times before with Julius Caesar and, of course, Mark Antony, and even tried her fancies on Augustus, but he would not do it. So Egypt is fascinating. It's mentioned, over 730 times in the Bible. Most of it, of course, in the book of Exodus, but quite extensive. Along with the man Moses. Moses mentioned over 850 times in the Bible. Wow. So you can see right away by the usage of their name, they must be important and significant. They are. So again, one of the key elements of the Bible is that the Bible just assumes you understand what's going on. As we talked last week, remember, the Bible transpires over 1,500 years. In fact, as we look at Moses, or a little bit of Moses tonight, we'll look more in depth at him tomorrow, or next week, as well as the route of the Exodus. But you look at Moses, and of course Moses was told to take down the 10 Commandments. And I think we made mention of this last week. What did he write in? What was he writing back in those days? Was he writing Hebrew? No, it can't have been writing Hebrew because it wasn't even invented yet, if you take an early date for the Exodus. So maybe he was writing in hieroglyphics. I don't know. We'll find out when we get to heaven. Like I told you, you have your little black book, taking notes, keep it by your side, so that when you get to heaven, all these questions you've had on earth, maybe they'll be answered instantaneously. I don't know. But nonetheless, I hope I grab it when we go up, if the Lord does not tarry, to take it with me. So I've asked my wife to, of course, put it in my grave, so that it's close by. Hey, listen, the Egyptians had the Book of the Dead, right? They buried it with them. I have the book of, it's not the book of knowledge, book of questions. There you go, book of questions. So I thought we'd just take a couple minutes and review. I think we talked a little bit about this last year, about Egypt, but you probably already forgot, didn't you?
I wasn't here last year.
Oh, okay. So then we got some newcomers. But anyway, just as I may mention, 623 times. I said 730. That was Moses, actually, 730. Egypt, 623 times. It's a Greek word, like a lot of the words in the Bible. For ancient countries are Greek. Egypt is a Greek word. Mesopotamia is a Greek word. Phoenician is a Greek word. And so the Greeks, of course, were indebted to them to a lot of the language. But do you know where Egypt is? It's on the northeast tip of Africa, encompassing one of the largest chunks of land there in this region. The Egyptians called themselves, really they didn't have a specific name. A little later on we get to the idea that they called themselves Kemet. Kemet means black lands. In fact, this is basically due to the flooding of the Nile. The Hebrew word in the Old Testament is Mizraim. Mizraim, and if you notice the im ending, for you Hebrew scholars, you immediately recognize it's plural. All right, Mizraim. Because Egypt in ancient times, remember, was divided into two parts. Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, right? Lower Egypt would not be the south, but would be the north. And Upper Egypt would be the south. Why?
Headlands of the Nile.
What's that?
Headlands, elevation.
The elevation? No. Close.
The Nile flows south.
That's right. One of the only rivers in the world that flows from south to north, right? And it's the longest river in the world. The longest river in the world. So, of course, it has its origins all the way down further south in Lake Victoria. But like clockwork, it flooded every year, just like clockwork. And so it became a very fertile land. And so Egypt became the breadbasket of the ancient world. That's why Abraham, where did he move? Moved down into Egypt when there was a drought, because they always had food. So you look at Egypt as a sustenance for food. And eventually, of course, the Romans saw the same thing, and they just took it over and used it as their private repository for food, because the Nile just floods annually, like clockwork. In fact, it's so regular that the Egyptians came up with the 365 days of the year. Interesting, the calendar. Amazing. So quite amazing, and like I said, because it has a vital part in the life of Israel, specifically as it sets the stage for the book of Exodus. I mean, they were down there for how long? "400 years, were they not? 400 years in the land of Egypt. How much of the culture did they pick up? I'm sure they did. I'm sure they did. Well, Egypt, of course, today is the modern capital is Cairo, and it's a busy hustle and bustle place. If you've ever been there, how many have been to Egypt? I know Jim has. Jim went with me. In fact, I should have put a picture of him. I'll try to find it during the break. I was just going through my Egyptian pictures, and there's Jim. We had a great trip a couple years ago with a guy by the name of Jim Martin. We went everywhere. That was a fantastic trip. But anyway, so this is Cairo with the famous mosque there down at the elements. But the Egyptian people are very friendly. Really, we had no issues with them. And of course, it really is, as you know, a third world nation. No natural resources, basically, to think of today. Most of it, of course, is been wasted away. But food to a certain extent, but just not like it was in ancient times. So basically, once you get outside of Cairo, most of the villages look like you see here. So, but then nonetheless, significant. Anyway, Egypt, of course, has a long chronology, obviously, going all the way back to 3000 BC. And maybe I should create a Dropbox for this class. I could put some charts up there for you. But anyway, it goes all the way back, as I said, to 3000 BC. And then I just have it ending in the time period of Israel to the Iron Age. But this is a very significant as far as the pharaohs go, because as we'll look next week, who was the pharaoh of the Exodus? Who was the pharaoh of the Exodus? He's not specifically named in the Bible, although the Israelites built a city and they called it Pi-Ramesses. And we know that Ramesses has several different Ramesses mentioned, and we know in the Egyptian text, all the way back into the Middle Kingdom. And then we have another Ramesses, the most powerful Ramesses, Ramesses II, during what we call the 19th dynasty, 1200 or the 13th century. So is this the Ramesses? Is this why the text is mentioned? Big debate on that, and we'll get to that a little bit later on. But anyway, the Bible does mention it, that they built the city of Pi-Ramesses and Pithon and Pi-Ramesses. So I've never been to Pi-Ramesses or Pithon because it's in the Nile Delta, and it's basically badlands today. You really have to go with an armed escort to go in those areas because it's just so volatile. But anyway, the Egyptians, of course, were fantastic builders. And I'm looking at, remember last week I showed you our water system. I think the engineering cycle as far as who developed the technology first is really up in the air, although the Egyptians were, of course, very well versed because they built the pyramids way before the Canaanites entered not really before the Canaanites entered the land, but by 2600 BC, they had already built the pyramids 416 feet tall, two of them, of course, Cheops and his son. But you can see they are quite the engineers, being able to carve out of the ground. There's a great obelisk. This one cracked, so they left it where it was. And but this is over 100 feet long. And then they lifted it out of the quarry, and then they floated it down the Nile and brought it to the temples like at Karnak, a Luxor, and then of course some even all the way down into into Thebes, Memphis, I should say, in the northern part of Egypt, which is of course Lower Egypt. So quite amazing, quite amazing. So just keep in mind, the Egyptians, very powerful. This is one of the key originators of the Egyptian Empire. His name is Narmer. Maybe you remember your history. He's pictured in a couple of palette reliefs found in Egypt. And here you see, this is the palette. This is one side, and you flip it over, it's the other side. Here you can see that his helmet or his crown that he's wearing is canonical. But then if you flip it over on the other side, it's still canonical, but then he has this serpent-like structure, because we believe he's the one that united Upper and Lower Egypt. So he's wearing the symbol of the Pharaoh of both empires on his head. In fact, there is his name. You can go to Barnes & Noble and pick up a book, Hieroglyphics for Dummies. Yeah, they have it. No question about it. You only need to know about 600 characters. The syntax is not too difficult. You just got to know the meaning of the symbol, like the owl here in the chisel. That's his name, Nar-Mir. That's the syllable mir, and that's the word nar, our symbol, our pronunciation of nar, Nar-Mir. So look at that. I've taught you hieroglyphics, an easy, simple step, and I'm not even going to charge you for it. Anyway, you can see that he's conquering here, and some of the other significant motifs, which we don't have to take time to go into, but you can see the serpents here, exaggerated serpents of the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. Anyway, so the Nile, of course, is mentioned a few times in the Bible, but there's a big contrast where Abraham came from. Abraham came out of Ur of the Chaldees, which is in, I heard it? Mesopotamia. Specifically what country? Iran or Iraq? Iraq, all right? You contrast Mesopotamia with Egypt, and they're totally different. Most of Mesopotamia is desert. The only reason they can keep afloat is because they have, again, two rivers. What are they? Mentioned Tigris and Euphrates. In fact, it talks about those two rivers flowing into the Garden of Eden. But they don't flood at the right time. And sometimes they can dry up, unlike the Nile. So Mesopotamia didn't quite have all the niceties that Egypt had, all right? So significant, obviously, of location and climate in the ancient world. Same thing with Israel. Israel now is going to be moving, it's in their summer period, and of course the summer is just like it is now here, hot, a little bit more arid than it is here. But 2 seasons, a dry season and a rainy season. And that also affected very carefully the mentality of the people and their religious structure. They created gods based upon the weather patterns. The most significant god in Israel during the time of the monarchy all the way down through is Baal. In Israel is Baal. He was the storm god. Remember, Elijah challenged him on Mount Carmel to do what? Call fire down from heaven. And during of course, a dry spell. So, significant of the Nile, as I told you, the calendar, it also gave it order. Out of all the cultures in the ancient world, when you think of Egypt and you read about it in the Bible, and you know the Israelites were down there many times, they were very orderly. Probably out of all the societies, very ordered, very regimented, very concerned about life after death. Even so, they developed, of course, the Book of the Dead, which you can also buy at Barnes & Nobles. Basically prayers, incantations for after you die that you can say to get the things that you need, all right? Most every Egyptian was buried with one. It wasn't like there was just one Book of the Dead. Everybody, if you could afford it, had one, by the way. That also gave security. Egypt was isolated. And so that made it very nice. If you wanted to go attack Egypt, remember, you really had to plan in advance, because you had to go through the Nile, the Delta, then across the Nile, and then get all the way down into Egypt. I mean, it wasn't an easy task. Obviously, the prominence of the sun, the Egyptians worshiped, of course, Ra or Aton, the sun god. And so significant myths arose from this area, from the Nile. Anyway, so there's the Nile, isn't it? Beautiful. And It'd be nice we could take the whole class. In fact, we have a couple millionaires here. Want to fund the project? No? We could take a nice Viking river cruise down the Nile and travel. It's quite spectacular, no question about it. But don't drink the water. Don't drink the water. So again, other pictures of the Nile River. The lifeblood. It created the life of Egypt. Anyway, significant of the sun obviously was rebirth. So this was all going on. All of this was being infiltrated into the Israelites as they were there for 400 years. You have to understand the cultures. Like I said, you got Egypt, Mesopotamia, you got the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks. All of these cultures you've got to assimilate as you start understanding the New Testament, as you understand Malachi in parts of the Old Testament, all the way through. So you need a good Bible dictionary. I would highly recommend the New International Standard Bible Dictionary. Zondervan also has a nice one out. It's called the Zondervan Illustrated Bible Dictionary, which a lot of the pictures are mine. We sat at my house, three of us, and we put captions on all those photos for that dictionary. 5 volumes, not the 1 volume set, get the 5 volume set. And start reading up on some of these things. I mean, it's a fascinating world. Fascinating world. All of these things. Anyway, the Nile, of course, was identified with if you remember, Osiris, the god of the underworld. As they floated down the Nile, they believed to go to the netherworlds. Significance, therefore, of death is obvious as well. In fact, they prepared most of their life for death. When the Pharaoh was born, the son, right? Immediately they started building his tomb. Wow. And of course, we got lucky with King Tut. All the stuff that they thought they could take with them in the life after death, it never moved out of his tomb, of course. And of course, we found it all, or at least McCarter, not Carter?
Yeah, Carter.
Yeah, Carter. I'm thinking of that. Yeah, I'm thinking McAllister. Carter found it all, and it's all in the Cairo Museum. So anyway, the Book of the Dead obviously spells, as I already mentioned, incantations to reenact ritual acts. So the land was sacred. By the way, it was owned by the gods. Sorry, men, you couldn't own land. Only the pharaohs, only the women could own the land. Did you know that?
What?
Yeah, women owned the land. In fact, the pharaoh, to legitimize his rulership, he had to marry his what? Sister. So, you hope she was good looking, huh? Anyway, it caused a lot of inbreeding. Now, keep in mind, most pharaohs had more than one wife, obviously. But, yeah, so. But you wonder, Abraham passed off his wife as his sister. Things start to make a little sense when you start understanding the culture. See what I'm saying? So it's a lifelong study, obviously, all right? Anyway, of course, the Call of the Dead. Here's one of what it looks like. Papyrus skull. Well, he's actually holding one in his hand. And I'm not going to go too much more into it. By the way, Pharaoh, you know the word Pharaoh is mentioned quite extensively. The name itself, it means great house. Great house. Because he was, of course, seen as God. Therefore, his house was the great house. Anyway, you know very well the pyramids were already in existence. You wonder if Abraham picked up Sarah and said, hey, let's go take a vacation. Let's go down and see the pyramids, because they were a few 100 miles or so from where they were living, and you wonder if they were actually able to go down. So that's one of my questions. Abraham, did you get to see the pyramids? Anyway, all of these, of course, were for obviously for rebirth and for to be immortalized, actually, right? Immortalized. If you notice very carefully, what you see here is all the pharaohs' buildings, the major temples, the pyramids, but you know there were houses all around for the common people? You don't see them. Why? Because they're all built out of mud brick. Stone has always been a sign of what? Wealth and immortality. Immortality. Christ said, I am the what? The rock. I'm the rock that brought you out of the wilderness. I'm the rock. Immortality. Something else to think about. So all of these things have nuances that, I mean, and again, the people reading it back during the time of Moses all the way down through, they would have understood. They would have known what was going on. So a lot of imagery played on these things. Anyway, kind of fascinating, isn't it? Anyway, the pyramids, what they look like, quite the engineering. So maybe the Canaanites picked up some of their elements from them. Anyway, there's yours truly years ago. You can't climb up there anymore, but you could when I first went.
Why?
Because it's too dangerous and people fall and the rocks are loose and yep. Anyway, the Sphinx and so on. But of course the Israelites were down there in Egypt. And what is interesting is some of the tomb paintings that we do have. We have murals where they emphasize the skills and trades that the Pharaoh might need in his next life. They thought all these critters would come to life and they could put them in their service. And here you have one making bricks. There they are, kneading the clay. Here you see one drying, putting some of the bricks in the kiln. Some are in molds, putting them out for sun dry, because it really basically never rains in Egypt. Except, 2 years ago, did you see? Every 100 years, it snows. And Cairo got dusted with snow 200 years ago. 200 years ago. 2 years ago. It was all, I don't know if you're watching the news. But put that on your little phone, You can put temperatures and weather patterns, at a city. So I got Cairo, Jerusalem, some other significant places I'm looking at. You never know. Anyway, here you go. You have, again, this is, of course, they're getting water out of the Nile, making houses, and that's what the Israelites did. Here, they're still doing the same thing today. Sun-dried bricks, a little bit of straw on them. Wow. And here you can see the carpenters, the tools that they use to keep a straight line. Amazing. Amazing. This painting here dates to 1500 BC, about the same time the Israelites. Of course, these aren't Israelites. They're definitely Egyptians, right? I showed you an Israelite, I think, last week, but you can tell very carefully by the hairstyle. No beards. Israelites always had beards. Obviously cool, so not wearing a shirt, but amazing. Simply amazing. Yeah. Anyway, other temples, I'm not going to go spend much time in it, but later on, different periods. And I think, but if you look very carefully at Genesis chapter 12 and Genesis chapter 13, again, as I mentioned, there was a famine in the land. So Abraham went down where? Obviously to Egypt, because the famine was severe in the land. Came about when he came near to Egypt that he said to his wife, "See how you are a beautiful woman," so on. You know the story. I'm going to tell you, they're going to kill me, so I'm going to tell them you're my sister. Anyway, all of these significant texts are amazing. Anyway, also in Genesis 37, of course, with the story of Joseph, then they sat down to eat a meal, and they raised their eyes and looked, behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites were coming from Gilead, all the way down into Egypt with camels, bearing aromatic gum and balm and myrrh, on their way down to Egypt. From where? Ishmaelites. From Gilead. Where's Gilead? Modern day Jordan. You have a key story that highlights the trade down into Egypt. It's the story of who? Joseph, yeah. Where did they pick Joseph up? They were Midianites from Midian, which is also in Transjordan, and they picked up Joseph where? Do you remember? Yeah, bottom of a pit in what city? Ooh. Oh. Remember? Pit City? Is that what you said? All the way down to Shechem, if you remember, Shechem. And they brought them all the way down to Egypt. Man, that's a couple 100 miles, that's 500-mile trek. Everybody's trading with Egypt. So very significant. Anyway, Joseph got down there, and that'll be an important part as our story as well. Anyway, other significant reliefs of Egyptian life. Swimming in the Nile. Watch out for crocodiles. But you can see milking cows. Other scenes with pharaohs and their gods. Horus, Ra, the sun god, the falcon head. Boats. Fishing. All kinds of things. So a fascinating life, to say the least. Anyway, we do have a lake down there. It's called, you remember Jim going to the lake there? Pharaoh, they called it the Lake of Joseph. All the way up in as far north as we could get. other temples dedicated to Ra, the sun god. A fascinating culture, to say the least. Anyway, we are introduced in Exodus chapter 1, verse 8. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. The Bible gives us indicators like this all the time. But we wish he would have said, and the Pharaoh was, or Joseph had, which we know had a great rank, but his Egyptian name was. It just doesn't do that for us. Why? Because it's not significant to God. What is important, of course, obviously we saw last week, was the theology. What he's trying to introduce about himself. But this is an indicator there arose a new king. So that might be an indicator, we might, a little bit, as we'll get into it next, who the king of Egypt was that did not know the Israelites. And there are some major elements within that, obviously. So with that in mind, let's go to my text on, and I'm looking for it. Oh no. Thought I saved it. Philistines. Oh. There it is. Let's go to the, what's the date today? There it is. There we go. Let's take it back, and let's go back and let's take a look at the book of Exodus in a more detailed look. Last week, remember I gave you my 3 S's of Scripture? 4 S's of Scripture to study. Remember what they are? Story. Structure. Social and historical processes. And one more. Sources. Very good, class. All right. Just think, you'll be able to teach us next year. I can sit down and listen to you. Anyway, let's talk about the Exodus, all right? We've already labeled what it's all about is redemption and revelation. And of course, obviously, the Passover is now introduced for the first time. So in the book of Exodus, we have a lot of new elements interjected into Israelites' history, all right? Redemption and now revelation. In a dramatic way on Mount Sinai, Moses receives the 10 Commandments, or the covenant that God makes with his people of Israel. Revelation is significant in the ancient world. Revelation is what word in Greek? You know it. We have a couple movies named after the Greek word. Apocalypse. That's right. Apocalypse means revelation. Deuteronomy 29:29 says very clearly that unless I reveal it, you would know nothing. The ancient world, specifically Egypt as well as Mesopotamia, was in a vacuum. Did their God speak to them? No. They didn't speak to them at all because they didn't exist. Remember, Jeremiah just laughs at them. I can't believe what you're doing, making idols with your own hand, and then you worship the very creation, the idol that you created, and say, this is your God. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Yeah, they never spoke. They only had to rely on omens. In fact, the Egyptian practice to discern the will of the gods was augury. Anybody try that at home? No? Next week, bring in your cat. So we'll lay him on the table, cut him open, and we'll look at his liver. Which way the cat's liver lies will tell you yes or no. Augury, very popular. I mean, very significant. In fact, one of the great kings of Egypt, his name was Thutmose III, goes all the way up into Palestine, conquers Megiddo. Before he conquers Megiddo, he wants to know which way to go, and he says, I performed 7 auguries till I got the answer I wanted. And basically, it was a good thing because what he did do, take a less well-protected route, and he was able to conquer the famous city of Megiddo back in the 15th century.
Say cats are a god of Egypt or something?
They're not specifically a god, but they were used for all different types of rituals, and they did use them as some type of omen sign, and some type of good luck. We see cats pictured all the time with the Passover. Anyway, redemption, revelation, and Passover, all right? So let's take a look. Just some free things here. Again, the word Exodus is English based upon the Septuagint, meaning the way out. So we have over our doors the word, there you go, exit. Anyway, the Hebrew name is from the first words in the book. And these are the names. These are the names. All right? Who is the author of the book of Exodus? Everybody thinks it's Moses. It's very difficult because it doesn't say specifically. Only one verse throughout all the Old Testament says that Moses wrote, although repeatedly throughout the later periods of Israelite history, it's always called the book of Moses. Jesus even refers to Moses. We know that Joshua could have been a writer, even Eleazar the high priest. This all dates back to 1500 BC. Jim, tell us a little bit about that period. What do you got? Picking on Jim today. 1500 BC. So over 2,500 or 3,500 years ago, the Israelites were there in Egypt. Isn't that amazing? You stop and think. Someone said if you wanted to prove the Bible in one word, what would it be? One word. Close. Jews. They've been around for over 3,500 years, over 4,000 years. Where's the great Assyrians? Where's the great Babylonians? Where are the great Egyptians? Wow. The Jews, how do they survive? How do they survive? Amazing. So all the way back, we date the book of Joshua, Exodus, somewhere during the late Bronze Age, it's called, right? Late Bronze Age. Remember last week, just to refresh your memory, I gave you the time periods. It's all divided by the Bronze Age. We have three periods: early bronze, EB, middle bronze, MB, late bronze, LB. Goes all the way back to 3200 BC to 1550. This goes to 1200. This goes to from 1550 to 1200, and this goes down to about 1000 BC. Late bronze, right? All right. 1300 BC, I should say. So let's take a look at the purpose, again, the message of the book. I hope you can read it. I'm trying to pick out different colors, but this is the famous temple at Karnak with the famous statue of Ramesses there. Anyway, what we have, as you look very carefully in the book, we have Israel's national origin, all right, developing as a nation. And they're going to move lock, stock, and barrel out of Egypt and eventually find their way into the land of Canaan. So we have a salvation story, if you will, a salvation history. In fact, really, if you wanted to characterize the whole Old Testament, that would be the theme, I think, salvation history. Right from the very beginning, all the way down till the silent years, and then, of course, there appears Jesus. All of it developing salvation history. And so we see this is, God chose this nation, and of course there was nothing in particular, but it became the apple of God's eye. So he says, now then if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my possessions among all the people, my possession among all the people, from all the earth that is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom, a priest, and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel. Exodus 9, 5 through 6. All right? Wow. Quite amazing. So, we have another significant theme. We gave you a couple themes last week, but these are a little bit more narrower. Specifically, as we move into the book itself, you're going to have right off the bat, Yahweh versus the Egyptian gods. How many gods of the Egyptians were there? Yeah, quite a bit. Quite extensive. So, picked out the one you liked, all right? You liked the best. So you have that's right off the bat. You got Moses introduced to Yahweh, and he goes fights the Pharaoh, and this is the first confrontation. Whose God is bigger? Wow. Huh? Obviously. And then so battle between Pharaoh, who's divine king, and Yahweh. So how many went to see the movie of the Exodus? It was interesting.
Yeah.
Great animation, reconstructions. But anyway, fascinating to say the least. But at least Hollywood is doing something. I mean, I guess whether good or bad, I don't know. Anyway, Moses is the only messenger in the book. All right? Do we put ourselves in God's place, or are we his messenger? Yeah. Yep. Anyway, this is the great Ramesses II. This is also possible one of the pharaohs of the Exodus. There's also significant themes within the book. Obviously, the Exodus event, right? God's self-revelation through the covenant and law. God takes Moses where? Up to Mount Sinai. Jim and I have been to Mount Sinai. Some of you maybe been. How many have been to Mount Sinai? Jim and I. Right? Wow, one of possible 7 locations for Mount Sinai. But it's interesting. He takes them to a mountain, right? Mountain theology in the Old Testament. How important is that? God calls the city of Jerusalem Mount what? Zion. Mountains everywhere. Fascinating. And of course we have the wilderness wanderings. Not dominant in the book of Exodus, but there. Anyway, here we have a beautiful picture relief at the temple, Medina Habu, of the mortuary temple, again of Ramesses on his chariots. Of course, you can see very carefully the Pharaoh was deified. Look how big he is compared to all the other people. We're small people. Pharaoh is always twice, maybe 3 times the size. Always pictured that way than all the other people, because he was seen as God. Seen as God.
He was deified. Why are horses small?
Because he has to have a big horse. And go along with his big body. Can't have little horses pulling a big God. That's basically it. Anyway, other key concepts of imagery that we have. Redemption, introduced to us for the first time. Redemption. A key word in the New Testament, isn't it? Translated by 3 different words, redemption. Passover, obviously, bondage and slavery. How much is that motif used throughout in the New Testament for our salvation experience? And then we have the introduction of the tabernacle, which is going to be a special lecture, the objects within the tabernacle. God's law, the 10 commandments, something new. Key verses, I like these. I singled out some key chapters. Obviously, the Passover is one of them. And then, of course, the 10 commandments in Exodus chapter 20. That should be 10 commandments. My key verse is this, Exodus 3, 7 and 10. Specifically, verse 7, it says, "And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt," right? "And I have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their sufferings." Then 6:6 says this, "So therefore, to the sons of Israel, I am Yahweh, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from bondage. I will also redeem you with an outstretched arm and a great judgment." Now, it's always puzzled me, why did God allow Israel to go down in Egypt in the first place? What's he doing for it? What's he doing to them down there? Huh?
They went down because of famine.
They went down because of famine, but
They went down just a family. They come back a nation.
nation building, as we already mentioned in the earlier themes, no question about it. Building a great nation. And we'll talk about how many people actually came out of the Exodus as well. Anyway, so you got some significant as far as the context. There's the beautiful Nile down at Luxor. Let's take a look at the historical elements. And here's some of the, we'll look at some of these themes a little bit later on, but did you know there's a big issue about the dating of the Exodus? All right? When did it transpire? We have a couple of significant references in the biblical text. Obviously, one of the key ones for a high date and a low date. The high date is that when Solomon built his temple, he makes a prayer. And he said, it's been how many years since they came out of Egypt? 480 years. 480 years. Wow. Now that's interesting. Now we know exactly when we can date Solomon pretty good, based upon other indicators. That puts it back to about 1440 BC. There's also one other reference we'll look at later on, and that's the reference in the book of Judges. It talks about Jephthah. And he says to the people in Transjordan, says, "Why are you harassing us here? We've been here for over 350 years. Again, the time frame lines up. But other people say, no, it should be dated lower to the 13th century, about 1200 BC, or 1250, 1245, because the Israelites built Pi-Ramesses and Pithom, which we'll talk about. And they're not in existence until much later. So that puts us somewhere in the end of the 19th dynasty if you take that element. Anyway, Egypt is weak, obviously, during this time period. And obviously, God is able to raise the Israelites up and allow them to exit. This is very important because this is the scenario that you see throughout all the Old Testament. Whenever Israel is strong, obeying God, everybody else is weak, and they're allowed to prosper. But there's always a problem with the nation of Israel. So when the cat's away, what happens? Yeah, when prosperity comes along, they get a little overambitious. They start worshiping other gods, forget about Yahweh, and before you know it, they're right back in the same state again. See that common throughout the book of Judges. So anyway, it's a period of ancient world, the whole ancient world is in flux. Very significant. There's also some very significant political features you got to keep in mind. We talked about this. This is part of the social and historical processes. If you want to understand the mentality, again, of the people of Israel trying to come out, what was transpiring? What allowed this? What caused this? That caused this great migration that the Israelites could leave. Israelites, of course, were slaves in an urban society. Where did they live? The Bible tells you very clearly where they lived. In what land? Land of Goshen. Yeah. Now, of course, I told you my dad was a preacher, and my parents would never cuss, but obviously. But my mother, when she'd really get mad, that was her favorite word. Good land of Goshen. That's about as mad as she gets. Good land of Goshen. I'll never forget that. Good land of Goshen. All right, if it's a good land, all right? Good land of Goshen. Anyway, so as you may mention, tribal organization, that starts to happen. Solidification. Anyway, so all of this, you see, was in the backdrop of God working to develop the nation that he wanted. So he brought them down to Egypt to solidify, because keep in mind, again, 400 years is a long time to be in Egypt and yet be able to not adopt all their practices, accept their culture, their customs. I'm sure some of them did, obviously, but begin to gel. Wow. Anyway, fascinating world. Fascinating world. Anyway, I showed you the the brick making already as well. Anyway, we also have a patriarchal society, so we have a transition, obviously, from polytheism to monotheism. How significant is monotheism in the ancient world? Awesome. Contrast between Israel and the other nations. There's nobody monotheistic. Everybody's polytheistic. This just drives the scholars crazy. How can you worship one God when everybody worships many gods? Unbelievable. The scholars still can't account for it today. They attribute it to, if you remember the sun god, his name was Akhenaten, Aton, all the way down, and eventually moved his whole family, the whole kingdom, down to Amarna, dedicated to the sun god, elevating the sun god above all the other gods, but I don't think he was a true monotheist by any means, but nonetheless, very interesting. Monotheism. Anyway, so from urbanites, they're going to be, of course, nomads for a while, are they not? They go in the wilderness. What happens to them in the wilderness? You remember? They wander, and what happens to the people? Yeah. Everybody what? From what age up?
30.
That wasn't 30. Remember, 18 and older died. Wow. So you got fresh recruits coming into the land of Israel. Most of them didn't even have any skills of building. Some of them maybe had some war skills, but wow. Anyway, all these things you got to consider when you're thinking about what transpires. Anyway, so as you look at the structure or organization, we kind of talked a little bit about this last week, but you have some literary structure and themes. You have an outline of Exodus. You have literary features, which we looked at some of the sources last week. But if you look at the content, a very key theme here, obviously, is a contrast between Moses' heart and Pharaoh's heart. Because now you have Pharaoh's heart going to be what? Yeah. You got a covenant and obviously the tabernacle. So all of these play a significant role in understanding the Exodus. So here's the outline of the Exodus. I've got divine deliverance, chapter 1 through 18, divine revelation, chapter 19 through 24, and divine indwelling, chapters 25 through 40. Anyway, this is Queen Hatshepsut's temple down there at the Valley of the Kings. She, some people think, is the Pharaoh of the Exodus. If you take the high chronology and not the low chronology, you take the low chronology, you'll be up with Ramesses II. But Queen Hatshepsut, remember, her son is going to be the famous Thutmose the Third. Thutmose the Third. He hated his mother. Mainly, some people think because she adopted Moses as the official heir. And so if you went to the movie and saw, remember the two brothers fighting each other, some people develop that's probably the case if you take this high chronology date. Kind of interesting. Anyway, beautiful mortuary temple, one of the beautiful ones, most fantastic ones there in the Valley of the Kings. You also have some literary other formats, right? The 10 plagues, 10 commandments. Huh. What, 10 plagues, 10 commandments? Interesting. Treaties, God versus Pharaoh. This is Ramesses II, very powerful man. Lived for over 76 years. Had how many wives? I don't know, 40 wives, fostered 136 children. Wow, that's right. Ramesses. That's Pi-Ramesses mentioned in the first chapter of Exodus. Pi-Ramesses. This is all the way down to Aswan. Powerful king, powerful ruler. Anyway, kind of fascinating. That's the low chronology. Right? You also have other literary features. Moses' birth, the saga of Moses' birth. Wow. Remember, he was an Israelite. The new Pharaoh arose. That could have been his, the Hyksos. We'll get into this. People call it the Hyksos, but we're not real sure yet on this. But saga of Moses' birth, because his name Moses, remember, means what?
Drawn out of the water.
Drawn out. It's a common name of some of the pharaohs. That's probably not his real name. Don't know what his parents named him, but this is what the pharaoh's daughter named him. Interesting. Brief stories. We have poetic episodes, theophanies. What's a theophany? Yeah, theo, God, phany, photo. You get a picture of God. Hymns, genealogical information, judicial, moral, and ceremonial laws, itineraries, all these things that we kind of looked at last week. List. These are all types of sources that, if Moses, of course, obviously, I think, wrote the book of Exodus, he was, of course, trained, as we talked about last week, in all the schools of Egypt. He knew how to write. He knew how to develop documents. And again, all these documents in the book of Exodus, if you're going to get into it, you can compare it with other literature of Egypt specifically. And guess what? They date basically to the same time period of the Late Bronze Age, not the Iron Age, not later. Some people think all of this book of, at least the Pentateuch, was written during the Intertestament period. Greek influence. But none of it dates because of the literary features within the book dates to the time of the 5th century of the Greek period. It just doesn't match up, doesn't line up. Literary analysis, it's a fun practice to get into if you're early into it. As I told you last week, Kenneth Kitchen's book does a lot of this for you. Anyway, there he is. Who's this? Who's the sculptor? Very good. Michelangelo's Moses. So what do we know about Moses? The call of Moses. Notice, this makes a second beginning in the Bible with Moses. A second beginning. Moses. Well, of course, a couple key things that we have about Moses that you're familiar with. Theophany in Exodus chapter 3. He's over in Midian, and he goes and is taking care of his flock, and his father-in-law's flock, and what does he see? And for the first time, we're introduced to who? Yahweh, right? Yahweh. Which means, what does Yahweh mean? It's the name of God. What is it? Remember, it got Jesus into trouble. Remember how they brought Christ up on charges for blasphemy? Because you claim to be the Son of God. You said, I am. That's right. This is the first person of the verb to be. All right? First person of the verb to be. I am, you are, we are. Remember that? I am. What does it mean? I don't know. What does it suggest? A lot of different things. People think eternality, continuing existence. So now Israelites, it's interesting to note because Abraham in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 8, when he's at Bethel, he says, and he addressed the Lord his God. And they use this name, he uses this name Yahweh. Yahweh. The question is this, did he actually know his God by the name Yahweh? We have all those other terms that you know very carefully, like El Roi, right? El Shaddai. All of these names that we have, the pendants down below. Those are, he's introduced in the book of Genesis. And now in Exodus chapter 3, for the first time, we have the name Yahweh introduced as their God.
He asked him who he is, and he says, I am.
That's right. That's his name, Yahweh. That's the first, that would be the, like I said, the form of the first person singular of the verb to be. I am. That's how you would start off if you're going to start a sentence. I am Jose Emmanuel Labor. Whatever. I am. That's what he gives his name. And it's spelled, that's how it comes out, Yahweh. I am. I am that I am. But we're introduced now for the first time, Israel, to Yahweh in a monotheistic faith. Manifestation of God, all right? Of course, he says very carefully to Moses, take off your sandals, you're on holy ground. Anyway, in Exodus chapter 6, verse 3, the name of God is El Shaddai, or Yahweh. You can compare that, as I told you. Anyway, new significance to the name during this time period? I believe so. I believe so. Moses, first one to get it. Anyway, look, of course, you have some other significant themes of Moses, his excuses, right? If you look very carefully, at least four times, questions of inadequacy. You know these very carefully. Questions of authority in relationship to, as he's addressed God, who am I? God responds, I will be with you. Question of authority. What is your name? I am. Who I am. Question of credibility, chapter 4, verse 1. They will not believe me. Anyway, I'll equip you, Moses says, or God says. Question of eloquence. Well, don't worry about that. Who made your mouth? Anyway, you remember Charlton Heston's, right? They haven't made a new one of Moses. I guess they're trying to. But anyway, if you look at contrast that with Pharaoh's heart within that first couple of chapters, it's amazing. I told you the contrast. And here again, I told you Ramesses was a prolific builder. There he is again, conquering his enemies. You can see him in a bag. He's got his hand raised, probably with a mace head. Very fascinating study. I wish I had more time to go into it. But God hardens Pharaoh's heart. Pharaoh hardened his own heart. There's 3 formulas within this. And it just says flat out, his heart was hardened. If you look at some of the different attempts to explain, here you have Hebrew theology of no second causes, or secondary causes. He does it himself. Literary device, some people thought this is a literary device to show the need for another plague. Hardened his heart, and God sent another plague. Modern theology, some people think it's just all predestination. Listen, remember, I don't know, can anybody come to God on their own free will? Faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God. God draws us. Anyway, divine confirmation of human intent. I said that was Ramesses, sorry, it's Thutmose III, maybe Queen Hatshepsut's son. Wow, fascinating. Anyway, it's fascinating to look, again, at some of the other themes. Oh, back up. One more. 10 times Pharaoh's hardened his own heart, 10 times God hardens Pharaoh's heart. That's Hatshepsut. That's what she looks like. Remember the only woman, one of the few women pharaohs outside of Cleopatra? That's on her mortuary temple there. That's what she looks like. I guess that's what she looks like.
I think so.
Of course, the wig was always common. It's part of the god Hathor, but nonetheless very fascinating. She could be the pharaoh of the Exodus. Anyway, fascinating study. You might want to check it out. Then Pharaoh's response to God all the time, no. God of slaves, don't not tell me what to do. Who do you think your God is? Go but stay in the land. Stay close to the present situation. Go, he says, but men only. Partial involvement. Go but leave the flocks. Don't go overboard with this religious stuff. Go, finally, after the death of his son.
Get out of here.
Yep, no restrictions. Fascinating study. All of this within the text. The plagues, obviously, 10 of them, for all the way down from before starting off with turning the water into blood. That was kind of weird in the movie, if you saw the movie. Remember how they said they started going? The crocodiles rose up and started eating everybody, turned the river to blood. Frogs, gnats, flies, plagues, cattle. All of these, by the way, have some relationship to the Egyptian gods. No question about it. Boils, locusts, hail, darkness, and then death of the firstborn. And we're introduced to the story of the Passover. Fascinating.
What,
What's that?
I'm just curious, so you said that 10 times God hardened his heart, hardened Pharaoh's heart, and then 10 times Pharaoh hardened his heart.
That's right. Within the text, it tells you both. That's what we're trying to analyze a little bit. Don't know. I gave you different literary ideas possible here, all the way back up into this slide here. Hebrew theology of no secondary causes. Literary device. Maybe it's a literary device to show the need for another plague. It's not specifically clear.
I'm sorry, it was
Yeah, a little fast.
quick.
Yeah, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because you can, a lot of different commentaries on it, but I think it's more of, I think God hardened his own heart, hardened his heart. Anyway, the plagues obviously will close here, but the river plague, water turned to blood, insect plague, gnats and flies, disease plague, crop plagues, mystery plagues, darkness. Theme in the plague, what's the theme? The Pharaoh may know that I am God.
Wow.
So we're introduced to another significant element. God always acts, time, place, and with people. Contrast that with Mesopotamia, Egypt. Their God never interacts with time, place, with people. God is documenting all the time throughout throughout all the Old Testament that I was there. That's why you have 2,000 cities mentioned in the Bible. That's why he tells you that's why they're in the land of Goshen. He tells you what they did in Egypt. And he tells you what cities they conquered when they came into the land. Because he's telling you, I was there. Where's your God? I was there. And interacting with time, place, and with people. Unlike the ancient one. So a distinction clearly between Israel and Egypt. Then last, were the plagues miracles? 4 reasons why. Yes. Selectivity. Always missed Goshen, didn't it? Mortality. Morality, excuse me. Meet moral the demand. God deserves to be worshipped, obviously. And intensity. By God's will and Moses' command, those things happen. Wow, amazing. Well, anyway, so that gets us through the first part, and next week we'll go into the Exodus and we'll take a little bit more closer look at the Pharaoh and what biblical evidence we have, and try to relate some of the significance of why it's important to know a little bit about these issues. So, anyway, I'll be here next week. If the Lord don't come. If I don't see you here, then maybe I missed out. I don't know. Thanks.